Well, today is sauerkraut making day, St. Patrick's Day. Cabbage is cheap. So this is the day that I make my annual supply of sauerkraut. I have some equipment here. This is a cabbage shredder. Bought it mail order. It's from, I think, Czechoslovakia. Got a Rubbermaid tub here. Over here I've got my fermenting crock. I've got a food processor bowl full of shredded carrots, cabbage, halved and cored, kosher salt, cabbage masher, and a couple scales. You could probably get by with one scale, but I've got two, so I'm going to use them. One for weighing the cabbage, one for weighing the salt. And I think that's about all the equipment. A couple bowls. So I'm going to get started shredding. I like to use some rubber gloves when I'm shredding because those are really sharp. And I have sliced my finger on them before. I don't know if the gloves really offer that much protection, but it's a little bit anyway. Just wanted to point out the technique I use with this shredder. Got my cabbage in there. Palm of my hand on that. Fingers outside the box. If you do this, fingers will eventually get down there close to the blades. You can put your fingers outside the box, kind of resting on this rim, and just push down with your palm. You're much less likely to cut your palm than your fingers. When it gets down low like this, put another half head of cabbage on top. The cabbage shredder is really the right tool for the job. In probably 20 minutes, I've got close to 25 pounds of shredded cabbage here. You can certainly slice it by hand with a knife, but it takes a lot longer. Okay, so the next step here is to mix in the right amount of salt with the cabbage and the carrots. So I start out with a nice big bowl. I've got a scale here that does kilograms or grams, and turn the scale on. Zero it out. And I'll add a few handfuls of the cabbage, some carrots, and I'll get a weight. 997 grams. So 2%, we'll make it an even number here. 1,000 grams. 2% of 1,000 grams is 20 grams of salt. So, take our little scale here, turn that on, zero it out, take our kosher salt, and measure out 20 grams of salt. Once you have it in the crock, use your masher to pound it down. The idea is you want it packed in here really tightly without any air spaces. That salt will draw the juice out of the cabbage, and kind of bruising the cabbage like this helps it to do that. And hopefully, ideally, that cabbage and the salt alone will make enough juice to cover up all the cabbage. You won't have to add any water to it. Do this for every layer. So just repeat that process until you've got your crock full. So just a little update. I'm getting towards the bottom of the cabbage. It may not all fit in here, which if that's the case, that's not bad. You can use the shredded cabbage to just saute, have as a vegetable, or you can use it as coleslaw or any number of other things. But it does pack down quite a bit in here. Now, as you're packing it down, especially at first, it's going to seem awfully dry. Don't worry about that, because it takes a while for the salt to draw the juice out of the cabbage. So as you keep going and you keep mashing, you get to the end, you're going to start to see some liquid in there. And if you're all done with the mashing and it doesn't look like there's enough liquid, just wait a few minutes and see if the salt will draw out some more juice. If it doesn't, you can make up a 2% salt brine and add that to it. You don't want to fill this up all the way to the top. You want to get it close, but then there's a couple of stone weights here. And you put those stone weights on and you press it down, and that will push some of the juice up. And basically you want the juice to cover these stones by probably a good inch when you're done. So you got to leave room for that. So I'm just going to keep working on this, and I will show you where we're at when we're done. Okay, we got all of that cabbage in this crock, which is a 3-gallon crock. The total amount of cabbage ended up being really close to 22 pounds, plus several pounds of carrots. It was a bag full of carrots.
It was 2 pounds.
I believe 2 pounds of carrots. And so we've mashed it all in there. As you can see, we've got a little bit of space still. If you put the masher in there, you'll see there's liquid right below the surface there. Liquid looks a little bit orange. That's because of the carrots. That's what we would expect. So we're not going to have to add any liquid to this. I'm just going to kind of push this down around the edges here where it's pushed up, so that all that ends up below the liquid. And this will continue to release a little more liquid even after we have it all sealed up. So I've done my best to clean up all the stray cabbage and stuff that ends up in that trough, because that can lead to some mold or something growing in that trough as this is fermenting, which isn't serious. That's not going to touch the food, but prefer not to have it happen. So now I'm going to take my stones, I'm going to slide them in there, press them down. You can see that liquid coming up there. There's a little bit of stray cabbage floating. It's not a big deal. You can't keep all of that from happening. So the stones are under liquid, and I think as the salt continues to work on that cabbage, there's even going to be more liquid. So this will be sufficient to keep it all submerged. So at this point, you can put on your lid, and we have to make up a 2% salt brine solution to fill this trough. Now you might wonder why 2% salt brine in the trough, since it's not really in contact with the food. For one thing, I don't really want mold growing in the trough, but for another, as the ambient temperature in the house gets hotter and cooler, you will notice that the level of the water in the trough goes up and down. The reason is, when it gets cooler, the air inside the crock takes less volume, and so it creates a little bit of a vacuum which pulls water down on the outside of the lid and up on the inside of the lid. In theory, it should all stay contained in the trough, but on the off chance that some of that liquid would be pulled in far enough that it would leak into the kraut, I don't want it to dilute the salt concentration in the kraut, so 2% will keep it the same. And conversely, when it gets warmer, you'll notice that the level on the outside of the trough goes up. That's because there's not as much of a vacuum in there. Also, you don't want to fill this up to the brim, because as this starts to ferment, the wild yeasts and lactobacteria that's in there will release carbon dioxide, which will create a little bit of pressure in there. And that pressure will bubble under the lid and through that liquid, and you'll hear just the occasional little bloop as that bubble comes to the surface. But what's happening actually a little bit is that lid is rising and falling a little bit with the pressure inside the crock. And if this is too full, when the pressure builds a little bit, it might spill over the edge. So you really don't want that. This is going to ferment for about 10 days to 2 weeks, depending what the temperature in the house is, and you kind of monitor that a little bit just by how frequently it bubbles. When it seems to have stopped bubbling, it's probably about done. And lower temperatures, of course, it's going to have to ferment longer for that to happen. Warmer temperatures, it'll go faster. If it's too warm, it's probably not a good thing. You don't get as good of a flavor. But you know, in the 60s or 70s, you should be fine. And you do have to kind of monitor over time the level of water in the trough, because that will evaporate a little bit over the course of the 2 weeks. And if it's looking too low, you know, first thing in the morning when it's a little bit cooler, it's going to probably look a little bit low. But midday, if it's still looking a little low, add a little more of that 2% solution, which you can keep in a Tupperware with a lid on it to add. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Let me get a little cup here. So on this little Pyrex cup here, you can see this mark. That's 200 milliliters, which for water at room temperature corresponds to about 200 grams. So 200 grams of water is going to take 4 grams of salt. I'm going to use hot water so that salt dissolves a little bit better. So there we've got 200 grams of water. That's 4 grams of salt. Just going to stir that up to dissolve it. Kosher salt is a little coarser crystal. It doesn't dissolve quite as quickly as table salt, but you don't want to use table salt that has iodine in it. That's why we use the kosher salt. So there you can see it's pretty well dissolved. We're just going to pour that right here in the trough. Give it a little time because it's got to seep under that lid. There's a little cut here in the top of the trough. You don't want to get it completely up to the bottom of that cut. So that is about perfect. At this point, I'll usually just take a piece of masking tape, stick it on here and write the date on it so that I know when 10 days, 2 weeks has passed. I'll just leave it here on the counter, and that's all there is to it.